Daniel, Pearl Abyss added Denuvo to Crimson Desert. Is that something to worry about performance-wise? I'm reading very mixed opinions. Ranges from Denuvo will take a third of your performance to it doesn't affect it at all. And I'm seeing tons of other posts about Denuvo being added to Crimson Desert. Should we all be concerned? A lot of these comments are in my videos talking about the PC system requirements, where they claimed some pretty good performance at native resolution on a variety of graphics cards. And the developer is responding because there is a lot of discussion about this online. So Crimson Desert developer says not to worry about Denuvo because the impressive PC preview builds they've shown already had the DRM and are representative of the final consumer's experience. So this brings up a big point. So I will get into what is the evidence regarding how, if at all, Denuvo affects the performance of games. However, I really do think that this is a big point. So is this like a bait and switch on performance the way a lot of comments have implied, where they're like showing off preview builds and claiming this performance, and then suddenly the Steam page says, oh, Denuvo. So I understand why from one perspective, you could say, oh, they showed all this great performance, but now they're adding Denuvo. So that's going to make everything worse. Again, we also need to get into, is that a fair claim? Does Denuvo actually decrease performance? What kind of evidence do we have on that? But at this point, I mean, it is also possible for a developer to just lie. Now, I don't think that that's the case here. I think that it's not that the Steam page being updated to say that the game has Denuvo means that that is the time at which Denuvo was added to the game code. I don't think that that would necessarily be the case. So while obviously developers could just lie, I don't think we have a lot of evidence for them to be doing that here. I would probably take their word for it that the game code that has been being reviewed and performance benchmarks being shown for is likely to already have the DRM in place. I don't see any reason not to believe that. Now, that, well, I think does answer the question, is this some kind of bait and switch? It doesn't necessarily relieve any concerns about Denuvo being in the game and what that might mean for performance. Because I want to be clear that at this point, we don't actually have a lot of performance evidence. So for example, the developer does reference the Digital Foundry performance video that was already available at that time. Now, to be clear, this performance video, if you actually watch it, this was not actually Digital Foundry doing the testing. They were sent footage of the game by the Crimson Desert developers themselves. Now, it was running at certain settings on certain hardware, and it looked very impressive for that, but it was not actually independently tested. Now, Digital Foundry has started to release some videos independently testing the game's performance. They have one out now for the PlayStation 5 Pro, and it's a very interesting video. And in this video, they have also mentioned that PC performance is also something that they are testing and will have out. But as of the time that I am recording this video, so if you're watching this in the future, maybe things have changed, Digital Foundry has not released any independent testing of the PC performance. But it does seem to be the case that when they do that, they will be testing code that probably does already have the DRM in place. So when you get the PC performance analysis from places like Digital Foundry, it will be representing the DRM in place version of that. So that's kind of the is there a bait and switch aspect of this. But deeper into this is, okay, but would the game perform better if it didn't have Denuvo? Now, this is always a very difficult question to answer, and there's a lot of very strong opinions on it. Because to actually scientifically test this is somewhat difficult because you need access to a game that is running the exact same build of the game, the exact same patch, the exact same everything in the system, both pre and post having Denuvo, like one with Denuvo and one without. And that is very difficult to get because oftentimes the patch to remove Denuvo when it happens can also make other changes to the game. Also, you can have issues where the like the cracked version of a game, does the crack actually remove Denuvo, or does it just like fake out the Denuvo draw calls? So there's issues comparing it that way. And again, oftentimes we don't know when there's going to be a Denuvo removal patch. So even if you want to test the game on the latest build with Denuvo and then the first build that removes Denuvo, to get like for like apples to apples testing can be a difficult thing to do if you don't know when to anticipate that removal happening. So with all of that said, I have done lots of research on this to try to find examples of times where we could get a pretty good test of this. So for example, back in 2020, and so again, also there's issues of, so when was this testing done? Is this the latest version of Denuvo and how it works and all of that? We do have some examples from which we can see a trend. So what is the trend? When we saw 4A games remove Denuvo from Metro Exodus, there were a lot of reports that performance was pretty similar, but that it did seem to be somewhat better, especially in CPU-limited situations, and also specifically calling out things like game loading time. Seeing this from places like DSO Gaming and overclock.net. And by the way, all my sources will be linked in the video description. Now, while we often get comments like, in our testing, we have found that Denuvo can be responsible for longer load times and minor reductions in game performance, the thing is, I'm not seeing a lot of benchmark numbers here for that, right? So sometimes you get these published claims that this is the case, but you don't always get actual like side-by-side benchmarks and bar charts, et cetera, to kind of go along with that. But that is a pretty common claim, is that load times can be affected as well as some minor hits to game performance. That's a pretty common claim, and when you look further into it, it's often at lower resolutions, indicating it's likely CPU-related stuff. Like the CPU is processing additional draw calls to check for the game's the Denuvo checks, basically. There's additional CPU calls. Now, it's up to the game developers a bit on where exactly that is implemented. And when we see more dramatic problems caused by Denuvo, it generally seems to align up with a bad implementation by the game developers on like how Denuvo fits in with any other anti-piracy measures they're doing, and when the game's the Denuvo checks take place. For example, there was some testing of back in 2021 with Resident Evil Village, where there was a lot of people reporting that the cracked version of the game ran significantly better than the official version of the game, where the official version of the game would stutter at certain times, predictably and repeatedly, whereas the cracked version of the game did not. Digital Foundry's Richard Ledbetter did post an article regarding this testing, where I just actually hit the height adjustment on my on my desk here. Anyway, all right, so there was some testing here comparing this. Again, all my sources will be linked in the video description, but they did mention that there were stutters that would happen, sometimes very large stutters, like 66 milliseconds. That's like 4 frames if you're running at 60 FPS. And if you run the game uncapped frame rate, freezing could actually hit a maximum of 130 milliseconds. And this can happen actually in combat. This was pretty significant, serious issue, but also confirmed that the cracked version of the game was not running that. And then claiming that the hacker mentioned that the pirated version of the game was solving some problems involving there not just being Denuvo DRM, but within those checks, there was also some like Capcom specific DRM anti-piracy features happening at the same time. And the fact that they were doing these calls during combat was one of the big issues, because if you do the anti-piracy checks like during load times, for example, it might increase load times, but that doesn't have a super negative effect on actual gameplay, even if it's a little bit annoying that the game takes a little bit longer to load, right? So there's definitely confirmation of particularly bad implementations of Denuvo and potentially other DRM issues causing some significant problems to gameplay. So people who say that Denuvo can cause significant problems to gameplay, we have actual evidence of that being the case. There's also a lot of videos that try to test a variety of games pre and post Denuvo patch. And again, oftentimes they show a wide variety of effects, sometimes kind of within margin of error, and also oftentimes these are single run, or at least they seem to be based on the evidence we see in the video, a single run with the Denuvo version, a single run without, where if you're looking at things like 0.1% lows, those things can be affected by random Windows crap, like if it happens to trigger a Windows update in the background, etc. So if you are just doing a single run measurement and you're looking at things like 0.1% lows and minimum frame rates reported, it's not always clear that enough runs, to get a super scientific analysis were performed on that. However, that being said, it always seems to be the case that if there is a noticeable performance difference, it seems to be worse on the Denuvo version. Sometimes the performance difference is very minor or seeming to be within margin of error or hard to say if it's conclusive. But in games where there are issues, it does seem to be worse on the Denuvo version. And the issues do, again, seem to crop up mostly in load times and in 1% lows, which can manifest as stutters during gameplay. And this also seems to be the case that lower resolutions seem to show these issues more frequently. That would also line up to likely being CPU-limited performance. This also just passes the it makes sense test because Denuvo is likely making additional draw calls on the CPU when it needs to test for whatever test it's running there for testing for the anti-piracy check. And so it makes sense that it is going to increase what your CPU is doing. And so the more CPU limited you are, the more likely you are to see performance issues. And that's why we could see this perform differently for other users. Again, there are games where we see larger problems. Also, I should mention that Denuvo is also not the only type of DRM, and it's not the only type that has shown problems. For example, very recently, we've been seeing Resident Evil 4 having Enigma DRM added to it, and then removed. And when it was added, there was testing showing that it was causing significant performance problems. And then Capcom, either due to those complaints or because they had maybe just implemented Enigma DRM for a brief window right before they launched a new Resident Evil game, because they maybe thought there would be more interest in previous Resident Evil games right before they launched a new one, and they wanted to have an anti-piracy thing going on right then at that time. It's unclear exactly if they removed it because of the performance backlash or because they only planned it for a short time window anyway. But the point is, there were performance complaints. Capcom pulled it, and it does seem to be, with multiple outlets testing it, confirmed that there were performance issues with the Enigma DRM. So basically, Denuvo is not the only type of DRM, and it's also not the only type that has shown measurable performance issues. And this is also kind of bringing up the tangential discussion of, okay, so, why do developers implement this? Why do they sometimes remove it? So obviously from the developer's perspective, what they're hoping is that especially at the release window of the game, they're hoping to get more legitimate sales of the game by making piracy more difficult when the game is likely to sell the most copies. And there's a cost-benefit analysis of how long to keep that in versus I think they have to, at least what I've seen about Denuvo, the deal structure with developers, the payment system, seems like it might be on like a time frame or subscription model or something like that. So they generally don't keep it on indefinitely, or there's some cost to doing so if they do that. Anyway, so all of this, what is there to make out of this, right? So lots of games launch with Denuvo, and it is seeming to be the case that evidence points to Denuvo does make the performance of a game worse. Oftentimes, just a little bit on load times or in 1% lows in specific situations, which is annoying, but oftentimes not a huge deal. Whereas there are clearly cases where it's implemented poorly and causes more significant problems. So are people wrong to complain about this? I don't think so. At the same time, I think if a game developer does implement it properly, there is some reason from the developer's perspective to try to protect legitimate sales of their game with some sort of anti-piracy protection. Whether that's actually effective or not, I'm not going to comment on. But you would see why a game developer or publisher would want to try to protect legitimate sales of their game during the launch window when it's likely to be the most popular. So as far as it being a bait and switch or not, though, if the developer is being honest that that the benchmarks that we will see of the game are based on a version that is representative of what end users will see, then it's not really a bait and switch. Now, I will say that from my personal perspective as a benchmarker of games, the most annoying thing that I've seen come out of Denuvo situations is, and it's unclear to me if every game with Denuvo does this, or if it's like an optional thing that developers or publishers get to choose. But I've run into an issue where I'm trying to benchmark a variety of CPUs and GPUs on a game that just came out, and I get a error mode that pops up that says too many computers have accessed this account's version of Star Wars Jedi Survivor recently. Please try again later. Jedi Survivor was just one example of this. So it can be difficult for me to do as thorough of testing as I would like to do if I can't use more than 5 different hardware combinations on a game. So like, do I do 5 different GPUs or 5 different CPUs? Or do I do like 3 GPUs and 2 CPUs? It's really frustrating to have that limitation, and it's like a 24-hour reset window for doing that. And the popularity of my benchmark videos, they're most popular when the game first comes out. So basically, it does make benchmarking games more difficult. And I really doubt that this 5 hardware limitation thing on its own has some major impact to piracy or game sales. So I think that this is a ridiculous aspect of a lot of games Denuvo implementations that literally just makes doing my job of benchmarking the games harder. And I really don't see how it benefits the game developer in any meaningful way. So that is one aspect of this that I would certainly like to see, because it feels like it just punishes me for trying to test the game and get information for people. So anyway, I hope that you guys found this video useful and or interesting. I know there's a lot of strong feelings about Denuvo. Feel free to voice your thoughts in the comment section. I hope all of you have an excellent day.